congratulate all those who are responsible for organizing this Malayalam Literary Society in this college. I'm a little confused about the language I should use. There is a linguistic confusion and there is also a generic confusion. So I thought I should best begin with a poem that reflects this confusion to a great extent, which is an English translation of the Malayalam poem Vic. മലയാളത്തിൽ തുടങ്ങുന്നത് വിക്ക് ഒരു വൈകല്യമല്ല, അതൊരു സംസാര രീതിയാണ് എന്നാണ്. Stammer is no handicap. It is a mode of speech. Stammer is the silence that falls between the word and its meaning, just as lameness is the silence that falls between the word and the deed. Did stammer precede language or succeed it? Is it only a dialect or a language itself? These questions make the linguists stammer. Each time we stammer, we are offering a sacrifice to the god of meanings. When a whole people stammer becomes their mother tongue, as it is with us now. God too must have stammered when He created man. That's why every word of man carries different meanings. That's why everything he utters, from his prayers to his commands, stammers like poetry. So poetry stammers, and I have no reason not to stammer inaugurating a Malayalam Literary Society in English. In fact, I had thought that might be I will be speaking English to a few Malayalam students, but I was told that it's going to be a kind of pan-Indian audience, and so one needs to speak in a language that hopefully will be understood by people from different parts of India. So that is what I call my linguistic confusion. And generically, yes, I'm a poet. I do, of course, speak too. So I'm not sure whether I should be just reading poetry or saying something. Maybe I should combine these, say something in general, maybe about the idea of Indian literature, and then, if time permits, read 4 or 5 poems. Whenever I speak about the idea of Indian literature, I recall a story that has been retold by none other than A.K. Ramanujan, the scholar whom you know or you ought to have known. You were not perhaps permitted to know. You know all the story of the wonderful and scholarly essay 300 Ramayanas and how finally the university was discouraged to teach one of the finest essays ever written on the great epic Ramayana. The story goes like this. This is actually a Kannada folk tale that Ramanujan has retold. One day, Rama was sitting in his court, holding court, with all his advisors. You know, he had great rishis, like hermits like Vasishtha and Vishwamitra for advisors. He was sitting with them while the ring on his index finger fell down and vanished through a hole in the floor. Hanuman, as always, was sitting close to him, ready to take orders from him. And Hanuman, as you know, had this strange power to become as large as a mountain or as small as a mosquito. So Rama thought maybe only Hanuman would be able to retrieve that lost ring because it had disappeared through a small hole, and only Hanuman could perhaps enter through that hole and reach wherever that ring has reached. So he asked Hanuman, please go and fetch that ring. Hanuman became very small and went down to the hole, and he found that he had reached the netherworld, what we call Padala. Reached the netherworld, and the women in the kitchen who were preparing the dinner for the king of the netherworld found a small animal falling down from a hole, and they decided to add this unique and rare animal to the king's meal, because he loved newer kinds of meat every time. So they wanted to please the king, and so they placed Hanuman on the platter along with all those other kinds of meat the platter held. When the king sat down to dine, he heard a little animal from the plate uttering the name of Rama again and again. He heard someone was chanting Ram, Ram, Ram. He looked at the plate and found that the voice came from the plate, from a little insect-like animal on the plate, and then he directly addressed the little beast and asked him, why, what are you saying, and why are you taking Ram's name? Obviously, the king knew Ram. And then Hanuman told him the whole story, that my master Ram has lost his ring, and I have come here with the mission of retrieving that lost ring. Then the king of the netherworld brought to Hanuman a huge platter full of rings and told Hanuman, you can choose that particular ring which is your Rama's. And Hanuman was at a loss because he never knew there were so many Rams, and he wondered, and he asked the king directly, oh, are there so many Rams? And then the king said, yes, there have been hundreds of Ramas, and there are going to be hundreds of Ramas again, and your master, the Ram you know, is only one of those hundreds of incarnations. And he also said, whenever one incarnation is about to come to an end and Ram has to go back to heaven, the ring of that Ram falls down and comes to the netherworld, and I have made this fabulous collection of Rama's rings. Hanuman obviously could not identify the ring, and he went back to find that Rama had entered river Sarayu and attained salvation. The story, in more than one sense, reflects the plurality of Indian literature in general, and definitely of Ramayana in particular. I am not going into that aspect at all. If you have read Father Kamil Bulke's Ram Katha, or because that's one of the best studies of Ramayana, or Paula Richman's books, she has now 3 books edited by her on Ramayana, you will know how plural, how rich, how diverse the Ramayana tradition is. And even the relationships are different, the characters, the importance of the characters is different, the settings are different, and so each language has so many Ramayanas, oral, written and performed. And Malayalam has 21 written Ramayanas besides several oral Ramayanas and performed Ramayanas in the form of Attakathas. Or typically, there are various plays like St.Stephen Nayar's trilogy, 3 plays based on Ramayana. Ramayana has been retold from subaltern points of view by contemporary writers, like Sarah Joseph, for example, has looked at Ramayana from a feminist point of view, and she has a whole series of stories where the women characters are the protagonists, stories around Sita, around Shurpanakha, most of the major characters, including Mandodari, Ravana's wife, in the story, where she rereads the whole of Ramayana from the point of view of a contemporary woman aspiring to emancipate herself from a patriarchal world. So there are ways and ways of looking at Ramayana, reading Ramayana, and this can in general be said also about Indian literature. There are generally 2 or 3 positions on the idea of Indian literature. So one is that there is a literature which can be called Indian literature, and that is reflected in the famous pronouncement by Dr. S. Radhakrishnan, the old philosopher president of India, and also himself a writer, who said that Indian literature is one, though written in different languages. But Nihar Ranjan Ray, a major critical voice from Bengal, has a voice of dissent, and he says, no, there cannot be an Indian literature because there is no single language called Indian language. We have many languages. We have Bengali and Oriya and Hindi and Malayalam and Tamil and Telugu. So we have these languages, so we can speak only of Telugu literature or Tamil literature or Kashmiri literature, and not of an Indian literature as a totalized entity. But there is perhaps also a third possible position. In one of his speeches, U.R. Ananthamurthy, the well-known Kannada writer, made a casual but meaningful remark that whenever you look for the unity of Indian literature, you come across its diversity. And when you look for the diversity of Indian literature, you come across its astonishing unity. Perhaps this statement is closer to the truth than the other extreme statements about the undoubted existence of a unified corpus of Indian literature and the non-existence of an Indian literature. Because if you look at the history of Indian literature, to look at which I don't have time at all, you will know that there have been periods of isolated growth of different literatures in India, and there have also been periods of exchanges, of shared growth, of common aspirations, common ideas, shared concerns. So it has been a checkered history where there have been periods of unity as well as periods of diversity, and that is what perhaps makes it necessary to have a whole new cartography of Indian literature, where we need to mark the areas of isolation and the areas of interaction, and create a new, more complex and comparative understanding of the different literatures of India. One of the first problems we come across when we discuss this idea of Indian literature is its colonial understanding and a kind of Orientalist prejudices that have ruined to a great extent the possibility of a real and genuine understanding of Indian literature. Because the first histories of Indian literature were all written by scholars from the West, of course, wonderful scholars who studied Sanskrit and who tried to understand the ancient treasures of Indian literature. And it was, but then, in all these different histories, I'm not naming them, but there are quite a few, beginning with the history by Albert Weber, the history of Indian literature. There is one by Max Muller, which is the history of ancient Sanskrit literature. And there is Grierson de Tassi writing history of the literature of the Hindu and Hindustan. George Grierson has the modern vernacular literature of Hindustan. Maurice Winternitz, a history of Indian literature in 3 volumes. And Robert Fraser, a literary history of India. These are the first histories of Indian literature. And none of these, as you can see, was written by an Indian. And the result was, one, that Indian literature, until the 19th century, when all these, 19th and early 20th centuries, when all these histories got written, meant only Sanskrit literature. Even though they called their histories of Indian literature, they were ultimately only histories of Sanskrit literature, and sometimes they made also some references to languages like Prakrit and Pali. And remember, they were written mostly in the 19th and 20th centuries, by which time all the major languages of India had matured, had produced absolutely fascinating and rich literatures. And every genre of literature, we had poetry, and by mid-19th century, we had novel and short story, and all kinds of modern forms of writing. In spite of all that, you don't find any reference to, say, Malayalam literature or Tamil literature or any of the other language literatures in these colonial histories of India's literature. So that was part of the Orientalist prejudice that defined the idea of Indian literature in the beginning. And remember, even Tamil, which has a history of almost 3,000 years of fascinating writing, does not find a mention in any of these histories. Not to speak of the languages that got evolved later. Languages which have a history of, say, 1,000 years or even lesser than that. So they do not find any mention in these histories of Indian literature, so they are essentially histories of Sanskrit literature. And secondly, they are even within Sanskrit, they have a kind of exclusive attitude whereby they come to choose only what can be called high literature, or literature that was produced by, say, the poets who lived in the courts, or by those who belonged to the upper layers of the society, mainly Brahmins. So the idea was Brahminical to a very great extent. So you will not find a reference to, say, a poet like Yogeshwara, who spoke about the life of the ordinary people and the peasants in India at that time. You don't find a reference to even Shudraka's Mrichakatikam, which was one of the kind of more democratic kind of plays in ancient Sanskrit. So there was a kind of choice even in the texts that they decided to refer to in their histories of literature. So both these, along with the other Orientalist prejudices, that is the ideas about India, which many of them from Max Muller and William Jones to several others shared, also are reflected in the way they look at Indian literature and present Indian literature. Well, I have plenty of examples in my mind, but just to take one example, Robert Thapa, I'm sure many of you have read her book on Kalidasa's Shakuntala. So she says how the reception of Shakuntala was conditioned by an Orientalist perception when the play got translated into German and English, which were done by Max Muller and by William Jones respectively. And so she says that there was another Shakuntala, the Shakuntala of Mahabharata, who was an independent woman, a self-willed independent woman, who challenged the status quo, who questioned the ethics of the king who had deceived her, and who always remained a free, independent woman. But Kalidasa's Shakuntala, on the other hand, is a naive, simple, vulnerable, beautiful, exotic kind of woman. And it was this heroine that fitted so well with the Orientalist concept of the Indian woman, because the Indian woman was supposed to be all these. Not a woman with a will, not a woman with a power to challenge the existing order, to question patriarchy, but a woman who was vulnerable, who was very naive and coy and beautiful and wild in a particular kind of way. And it was this picture of Shakuntala that fascinated the Orientalists and made the play so famous in the West. Well, I don't think that was the only reason. It was a wonderful play. Definitely, that was a reason. But these prejudices also did play a role in the way they perceived a text like Kalidas's Shakuntala. So what I wanted to say was that the idea of Indian literature from the very beginning had been shaped by the West, and it was essentially Orientalist, and these prejudices continued to persist for long, even after the colonizers had left. And many continue to think of Indian literature as Sanskrit literature, and now perhaps that has been replaced by, Sanskrit has been replaced by English. Because when you go abroad and speak of Indian literature and ask them to name a few Indian writers, they generally come up with, of course, all the names you very well know, right from Arkenan and Nurtrajan, and much better, of course, more recent writers like Vikram Sethuramidao Ghosh, with whom I have absolutely no quarrel, who are wonderful writers. But then you very well know that all our languages have produced unusually excellent writing. I mean, looked at from an aesthetic point of view, from the point of view of form, or from the point of view of the use of language and idiom, from the point of view of structure, from the point of view of its relationship with society, and the intense insight it provides into the human mind. I've looked at from any of these points of view, all our languages have produced unique works of literature and great authors who perhaps remain unknown just because they have not been sufficiently adequately translated. And I was very happy to hear that one of the projects that the Malayalam Literature Society has is to translate the highly established and well-known Malayalam works, I'm sure, including avant-garde works, into English, which will be a great service, because English definitely has a major role to play in India as a link language, as a language of translation, and well, it is already a kind of lingua franca for India, whether you want it or not, even though Gandhi had dreamt of Hindustani, not the present Hindi, being the, which was close to Urdu rather, being the common language of India. But that was not to be, and we have come to live with English for long, and well, I don't have anything against that. Well, English can well be a lingua franca. But only that we should not allow this language, or any other language for that matter, to attain a kind of hegemony and to suppress our love for our mother tongue, for our literatures, and for the great works of the great writing that our writers in the different languages have produced. And I'm sure that this society will go a long way in ascertaining the value of literature written in Malayalam and bringing those wonderful works in Malayalam to the notice of students and teachers who do not know Malayalam by the kind of circumstance in which they were born and brought up. So, well, I want to say a lot about it, but I don't think I have all the time. I've already taken a lot of time. So my hope is that this by using English as a maybe a link language, this society will be able to reach out to the non-Malayalis and to tell them about the uniqueness and the grandeur of Malayalam writing, and also perhaps bring into Malayalam similar, rich writings from other languages, either directly as far as possible, or maybe through the medium of English. So what to go back to what I began with, Indian. So there is the possibility of the existence of an idea of Indian literature, because there have been a lot of exchanges. We have had movements. The first major movement in Indian literature being the Bhakti movement. I would take the Sufi movement also along with that, where for the first time the Indian languages asserted their identity and interrogated the status quo, interrogated the status quoist idea of religion itself. It questioned the rituals, it questioned the temples, it questioned all kinds of superstitions which went with religion, and all these great poets, right from Kabir and Meera and Tukaram and Namdev and of course the women poets like Lal Ded and Akka Mahadevi, all of them questioned various kinds of distinctions, man-made distinctions of caste, of creed, and even of religion, and definitely of gender. And so it was a major argumentative tradition and an interrogative tradition which tried to question the existing society, of course from a spiritual point of view, and to tell everyone that human being, whatever his or her caste or gender or religion, is ultimately one. And even though this was spoken in the language of spirituality, it was also a major egalitarian message spoken in a metaphysical language. So right from the Bhakti movement and the Sufi movement, which again took in a lot of Indian philosophy into it, to the later days of the freedom movement and the progressive movement and the modernist movement and the various kinds of subaltern movements which are coming up now, like women's writing, Dalit writing, tribal writing, writing around ecological issues. Up to that, Indian writers have shared a lot of common concerns and a common understanding of human life, of literature in general, and definitely of what we generally call the Indian mind, even though it remains an abstract entity to a great extent. So we need to today again assert that unity, and at the same time also be conscious of the specific genius of each of the Indian languages. Because any one of these approaches, if you take an extreme stand, both will ultimately be detrimental to an understanding of Indian literature. For example, if you take Malayalam literature, you need to know that yes, it is part of Indian literature. It also has had works inspired by the freedom movement, inspired by the progressive movement. It had modernist and postmodernist kinds of movements. It has its own Dalit writers and women writers. At the same time, all these have got expressed in a way which is very specific to Malayalam and to the culture of Kerala. And this can be said about other languages and other cultures too. So we need to know the specificity of the different tongues in which literature gets written in India, the specificity of the different cultures, the locale, all of which have an impact on writing, and at the same time we need to connect our literatures with the other literatures written in India in different languages. I think this should be perhaps the basic perspective of a society like this. Will remain, definitely speak about Malayalam literature. It's as the principal has so beautifully said, be proud of the literature that we have created. At the same time, also try to understand other literatures. Don't be parochial and sectarian or carried away by a regional pride. Be legitimately proud about the wealth of Malayalam literature. At the same time, also try to reach out and try to understand literatures written in other languages, and only perhaps through such a lively and vibrant exchange of cultures and literatures can we ultimately create an Indian literature that is dynamic, that is living, and that has a meaningful relationship to Indian life in all its beauty, diversity, and misery. Thank you. I think I should stop here. Maybe I should read two or three poems as I had promised. I want to speak at length about the idea of Indian literature, which maybe we will do later. ഈ കവിതകൾ ഞാൻ തർജ്ജമകളാണ് കൊള്ളാം. ഞാൻ മലയാളത്തിലുള്ള കയ്യിലെടുത്തിരുന്നു, പക്ഷേ now I don't have it. I'll read maybe two. I don't think I have much time. Read two or three. Gandhi and poetry. One day, a lean poem reached Gandhi's ashram to have a glimpse of the man. Gandhi, spinning away his thread towards Ram, took no notice of the poem, waiting at his door, ashamed as he was no Pajak. The poem cleared his throat, and Gandhi looked at him sideways through those glasses that had seen hell. Have you ever spun thread? He asked. Ever pulled a scavenger's cart? Ever stood the smoke of an early morning kitchen? Have you ever starved? The poem said, I was born in the woods, in a hunter's mouth. A fisherman brought me up in his hamlet. It is Vyasa. Yet I know no work. I only sing. First I sang in the courts, then I was plump and handsome, but I'm on the streets now, half-starved. That's better, Gandhi said with a sly smile. But you must give up this habit of speaking in Sanskrit at times. Go to the fields, listen to the peasants' speech. The poem turned into a grain and lay waiting in the fields for the tiller to come and upturn the virgin soil moist with new rain. The mad. I have always felt I know the mad, so-called mad people much better than so-called sane people. Because I have lived with my grandmother, quite a few, at least 5 people in my family had the disease. They were supposed to be mad. The mad. The mad have no caste nor religion. They transcend gender, live outside ideologies. We do not discern their innocence. Their language is not of dreams, but of another reality. Their love is moonlight. It overflows on the full moon day. Looking up, they see gods we have never heard of. They are shaking their wings when we fancy they are shrugging their shoulders. They hold, even flies have souls, and a green god of grasshoppers leaps up on thin legs. At times they see trees bleed, hear lions roar from the streets. At times they watch the heavens gleam in a kitten's eye, just as we do. But they alone can hear ants sing in a chorus. While patting the air, they are taming a cyclone over the Mediterranean. With their heavy tread, they stop a volcano from erupting. They have another measure of time. Our century is their second. 20 seconds and they reach Christ. 6 more, they are with the Buddha. In a single day, they reach the Big Bang at the beginning. They go on walking restless, for their earth is boiling still. The mad are not mad like us. Thank you.